Okay, welcome back, my friends. We're looking at 6-1 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the second lesson on Psalm 22 by Lacocque. And he is going to use the Hegelian structure of individuality, generality, and universality for his presentation. He begins with the emerging Ebionites in Jerusalem and the individuality of the lament. The basic aspects of this lament are the fact that the petitioner feels a need to repent, and that the petitioner also feels that he or she is engaged in a covenant relationship since pre-birth, since within the womb itself, and that God and the petitioner have a common enemy to overcome, namely the established privileged class, which would be the elite priesthood that happen to be oppressing the poor. So there's a petition for a synthesis between the redeemed past of the ancestors to be united with the unredeemed present of this individual. It's an asking for theophany, an actual justifying presence of Yahweh to bring the divine justice and to correct this situation. That's the petition. And it will include an opposition to the Zionist institutional theology that prevails and the representatives that want to hold up that Zionist theology. But it is an aporia for the individual. It is an unresolvable inner conflict with evil in the world that really doesn't seem to have an answer. So it's more or less an aporia of an unresolvable situation that can only be overcome through the transcendence of divine intervention. But Lacocque points out that this is an individual who is petitioning here, but this individual represents all of the poor, and all of the poor happen to be in the first century a designation for a very specific group, and Lacocque wants to emphasize this group. For Lacocque, the suffering, disenfranchised congregation happens to be the Hasidim Ebionim, or what we know as the Ebionites, and they are to be understood as Jewish Puritans of the Talmud who were very much anti-institution because they felt that Roman dominance polluted and defiled the Judaic faith, because Rome governorship interfered with the Judaic faith. So they were very much an outsider protest group, and they were led by James the Just in Jerusalem, and they later did take up a following of John the Baptist, and of course a following of Jesus of Nazareth by James the Just, the brother of Jesus. They did accept Jesus as the Messiah. They did not accept Jesus as deity, because the doctrine of deity really didn't emerge out of Jerusalem. The doctrine of deity emerged out of Antioch, where Peter was bishop and where Paul did all of his missionary work. That was out of the Antioch church north of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem church did believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They just did not believe in Jesus as deity, and it was led by James the Just, the brother of Jesus. The second moment is about the emergence of the rabbinic schools, and that's very important because the rabbinic schools are where rereadings take place. Rereading of the prophecy of Ezekiel, rereading of the Psalm 22. All of these are reread and reinterpreted by the rabbis, and the rabbi schools were really emerging in the first century, and the temple was quickly declining. The Sadducee priesthood was quickly declining because the indwelling of the doxa glory was going to be an indwelling within the individual believer and not within a stone and mortar structure. So the priesthood was declining, the Sadducees were declining, and the Pharisees were expanding and becoming teachers, rabbis who had their own schools, rabbinic schools, including the greatest teacher of all, who was Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was highly respected as a superior rabbinic teacher in Jerusalem. But this was the era of the rabbinic schools, and that was going to replace the period of the prophets. The prophets die out, and now it's a time of reinterpreting and rereading the prophetic writings, because, of course, Ezekiel was a writing prophet. He was one of the fundamental writing prophets. So it's a time of rereading and reinterpretation, and in view of new events. So this post-exilic period of returning to Jerusalem brings on new circumstances and new rereadings. The schools emerge, and we have examples of some of those rereadings. John 19:23 through 28, which is the theological gospel, by the way. The other three are not theological, but John is. And Christ's crucifixion is a fulfillment of both Ezekiel and Psalm. Both of the prophetic announcements are fulfilled in the Christ event. In Hebrews 2:9 through 18, Paul, in his theology, says that Christ takes up the suffering of Israel, and he is the fulfillment, again, of the Ezekiel prophecy of a new covenant, and the fulfillment of the new theology proposed by Psalm 22. Again, it is according to the theological writing of John and the theological writing of Paul. The Christ event is a fulfillment of both of those inaugurations. So verse 22 in Psalm now can be reread to say that any naming of Yahweh is predicated on the Christ event. And in Philippians, again, Paul's theology shows that praise and adoration first pass through death and crucifixion. I am crucified with Christ. So again, Paul's theology emphasizes that now we can go back and reread Ezekiel's inauguration of the new covenant and the psalmist's inauguration of a new theology as both being fulfilled in the Christ event. Both. Matthew, a Jewish document, takes up the Isaiah 53 document, which imprints Ezekiel 37, and says that Christ is the one who has taken up and borne our sufferings. So the entire nation of Israel, which has been a crucified Israel, their sufferings are taken up in the Christ event, and their Prince of Peace that Ezekiel spoke of is Jesus Christ, and that is the fulfillment of the inaugural new covenant. So we have 5 rereadings that emerged. The rereadings emerged out of the rabbinic schools, and of course out of the emerging Christian faith in both Jerusalem and Antioch. Those were the two primary congregations in the beginning. So out of Jerusalem and out of Antioch and out of the rabbinic schools, we had this emerging rereading of old prophecy, both of Ezekiel and Isaiah and the wisdom literature during the time of David and Solomon. That brings us to universality, and universality is going to transcend both the individuality of the Ebionites and the generality of the rabbinic schools. And universality is acquired, according to Lacocque, when Jesus adopts Psalm 22 on Calvary in abandonment, when he proclaims, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Israel has been a crucified people. In Christ, Israel's suffering is taken up into the teleology of Yahweh and marked with certainty of deliverance. And the individuality of the Ebionites and the generality of the rabbinic teaching is universalized on Calvary. So the telos of soteria, or the telos of Yahweh, reaches its eschatological fulfillment in the Christ event, and the seed of Israel is taken up into this eschatology, an eschatology that is imprinted and defined by the Christ event. So now we have the telos of soteria, or the telos of Yahweh, being fully imprinted by the Christ event. That is the truth. The Christ event is the aletheia truth, the tupos imprinting of the teleology of Yahweh. And that becomes a fulfillment of the inauguration of New Covenant from Ezekiel and the inauguration of New Theology from the Davidic wisdom literature. So it's a very much, Lacocque sticks very much to the Hegelian structure of individuality, generality and universality. But he wants to point out that we leave the realm of the prophets. In the first century, we enter into the realm of rabbinic schools, and it's a different environment. The realm of the rabbinic schools emerged the same time that Christianity was coming on the scene. And so you have new Didache teaching, new Didache doctrine, and sometimes that doctrine emerges outside Jerusalem. The doctrine of the divinity of Christ, it emerged out of Antioch, not out of Jerusalem. It emerged out of Antioch, where Simon Peter was bishop and where Paul did his missionary work and based his missionary work. So it is an era of Didache teaching and Didache doctrine. Remember, that's going to be different than Evangelion, proclamation. Now we're kind of emerging into Didache, teaching of doctrine and rereadings and rabbinic schools, and the priesthood is dying away. We are seeing the Sadducees rather quickly die away in the first century, and we know that a real elite group of the priesthood actually voluntarily exiled themselves to Qumran and ended up writing quite a few of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we found in the 60s. But this was a group that was exiled because the transition from the temple to Pharisee schools was quickly doing away with the need for the privileged priesthood of the temple of rock and mortar. The doxa glory of God would dwell in the believer from here on out under the new covenant and not in a stone building. So the priesthood dwindles away quickly. The rabbinic schools emerge, and we get very prominent figures like Gamaliel, who is the teacher who taught Paul, and that's one of the best illustrations right there. Then you've got the two schools coming together. You've got emerging Christianity and rabbinic teaching coming together in Paul. They actually intersect there because Paul had an excellent education through Gamaliel, the best rabbinic teacher in Jerusalem, and then couple that with the fellowship that he entered, and he is a key pivotal point for both types of emerging teaching and Didache doctrine. So this second lesson by Lacocque points out that we've made a huge transition now. We're actually making a huge transition from prophets to teachers, from prophets to wisdom literature, from prophets to rereadings. And so saving and protecting and guarding the scrolls is extremely important, and that's why the Qumran exiles took a lot of scrolls with them. All the scrolls at the Dead Sea discovery were not all written by the Qumran community. Many were preserved and believed to have been brought from the temple in order to be protected and guarded and reread and reinterpreted at the Qumran community. But it was a Sadducee elite group of priests who voluntarily exiled to Qumran because they felt, just like the Ebionites felt, that there was a defilement of the temple under Roman rule, where the governorship actually selected the high priest, and that was no longer an internal religious decision, but it became a political Roman decision. That meant defilement to the Qumran community. That meant defilement to James the Just, the brother of Jesus. But it's interesting to see that the Ebionites emerged as an anti-institutional group for a very obvious reason. The temple had been destroyed. The remnant returned to a destroyed temple and to a rebuilding period, a restoration period where a remnant would be raised up and be brought up within a new covenant of a theology of the poor and an openness and universality that would reach out where the Judaic believers would actually become image bearers of Yahweh, the God of the covenant. But we know that they didn't get that right, that they did not internalize that to its radical conclusion, and that it took a third intersection, not only the Ezekiel inauguration of covenant, and the psalmist inauguration of new theology. But the dunamis aletheia, power of truth from Jesus of Nazareth, to open the eyes of those in Jerusalem to understand this new covenant and to understand this new theology that welcomes and heals all who approach and excludes none. A true universality of the saving grace of Yahweh, interpreted by Jesus of Nazareth. But it was already there. It was already there in the written documentation from Ezekiel and the written documentation from the psalmist. But it needed the Son of Man to open the eyes of the blind and to blind the eyes of the arrogant religious leadership that was trying to cling to their privilege. But we'd find here that Lacocque reminds us that privilege was quickly dwindling away and the rabbinic schools were coming to the forefront. Jerusalem was becoming a rabbinic area of didache, teaching and doctrine. So it's a very good lesson because it really points out, I had not really realized when the Ebionites or why the Ebionites would have emerged, but it makes perfect sense that a remnant that returns to no temple but a restoration period, that you could actually begin to give a lot of strength to an anti-institutional type group of Puritans who very purely followed the Talmud. So James the Just and his group of believers makes perfect sense during this restoration period of a returning remnant. That makes sense to me now. It was led by James the Just, the brother of Jesus, but they didn't develop the doctrine of deity. That honor and privilege went to the Antioch church. And we have the first evidence of that at the very beginning of the letter to the Philippians, where Paul actually opened the letter with a doctrine of deity. And of course we know he wrote that while he was under house arrest in Rome, having already ministered to Philippi earlier. But it is interesting to see here that we have a very huge shift from prophecy to rebellious Ebionites, to rabbinic schools, and to a key merging between a person like Paul, who can be both a member of the rabbinic school of Gamaliel and a member of the Christian faith, who could learn and get instruction from people like John the Beloved and Simon Peter. So great lesson that really kind of shows us the transition period, and that takes us up through 207.